I had always prided myself on being a rational psychologist. My years of training and experience had taught me to dissect the complexities of the human mind, to find the logical explanations behind even the most bizarre behaviors. But all of that was about to be put to the test. It began with a phone call late one evening. Dr. Elizabeth Simmons, a colleague I deeply respected, was on the other end of the line. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation. "I need your help, Daniel," she said. "I have a patient here, a young woman named Emily, and I don't know what to make of it. Her behavior is beyond anything I've encountered." I listened intently as Elizabeth described the disturbing events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. Emily, a previously well-adjusted college student, had begun to exhibit erratic and increasingly violent behavior. She had attacked her roommates, spoken in languages she had no knowledge of, and shown an uncanny ability to predict future events with chilling accuracy. Elizabeth had conducted numerous psychiatric evaluations, searching for a rational explanation, but had found none. Emily's medical tests came back clean. She was physically healthy, yet her mental state continued to deteriorate. As Elizabeth spoke, I could hear the desperation in her voice. She was a true skeptic, much like myself, but she had reached a point where she could no longer dismiss the possibility of something beyond the realms of science. Reluctantly, I agreed to evaluate Emily. I had my reservations, believing that there must be a psychological explanation, perhaps a hidden trauma or mental illness that had eluded detection. Little did I know how profoundly this case would challenge my skepticism. When I arrived at the psychiatric facility where Emily was being held, I was struck by the eerie atmosphere that seemed to hang over the place. It was as if a palpable sense of dread permeated the very walls. As I entered the room where Emily was confined, her eyes locked onto mine, and I could see a flicker of malevolence in her gaze. We began the evaluation, and Emily's behavior grew increasingly unsettling. She spoke in voices that were not her own, alternating between languages I couldn't recognize and guttural, incomprehensible sounds. Her body contorted in unnatural ways, and she seemed to possess an otherworldly strength. I attempted to maintain my composure, chalking her behavior up to a severe psychological disorder. But then, Emily began to speak in a voice that sent chills down my spine. It was a voice filled with hatred and malice, a voice that claimed not to belong to Emily but to a malevolent entity that had taken possession of her. "I've been waiting for you, Daniel," the voice taunted. "You think you can analyze and diagnose me like all the others, but you're in for a surprise." I was taken aback, struggling to maintain my professional facade. This couldn't be real. It was a manifestation of Emily's fractured psyche, a grotesque coping mechanism. But as the evaluation continued, I witnessed phenomena that defied all explanation. Suddenly, one of the chairs in the room rose into the air. I froze, I couldn't believe my eyes. Emily's body contorted in ways that should have been impossible without breaking bones. Elizabeth, who had been observing the evaluation, looked at me with a mix of fear and uncertainty. She was seeing it too, and her skepticism was crumbling before our eyes. I decided to press further, to confront the entity within Emily. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice quivering. The entity laughed, a sinister sound that echoed through the room. "I am a shadow in the darkness, a whisper in the void. I have been with Emily since she was a child, waiting for the moment when I could reveal myself." Room grew colder and my breaths became shallow. I felt an oppressive force pressing against my chest, as if an invisible hand was suffocating me. Panic surged through me, and I struggled to maintain my composure. Emily's laughter, filled with eerie amusement, echoed through the room. Her eyes were fixed on me, but they were not the eyes of the young woman I had met earlier. They were cold, malevolent orbs that seemed to radiate darkness. In that desperate moment, when it felt like the shadows were closing in around me, the door burst open, and a priest entered the room. Father Michael, his face a mask of solemn determination, stepped forward with a crucifix in hand. His arrival was a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. Without hesitation, Father Michael began to recite the words of an exorcism, his voice unwavering and filled with unwavering faith. Emily's laughter turned into agonized screams as if an invisible force was waging a battle within her. The room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and I watched in astonishment as Emily's contorted body began to convulse and writhe. Her voice shifted between guttural growls and unearthly wails. As the exorcism continued, I could see a fierce struggle unfolding before my eyes, a battle between the malevolent entity and the unyielding faith of Father Michael. It was a battle that transcended the boundaries of my rational understanding, a confrontation with forces that defied explanation. Minutes passed like hours, and the room became a battleground of spiritual warfare. Finally, with a final, thunderous cry, Emily's body went limp, and her eyes cleared, revealing the terrified and confused young woman beneath. Father Michael lowered the crucifix, and the room seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The malevolent entity had been vanquished, at least for the time being. I helped Emily to her feet, and she looked around, disoriented and shaken. She had no memory of the horrors she had endured during the possession. Her eyes met mine, and they were filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. As Father Michael offered a prayer of protection and purification over the room, I couldn't help but question the very foundations of my rationality. What I had witnessed went against everything I had been trained to believe, everything I had thought to be true. Elizabeth, her skepticism similarly shattered, approached me, and we exchanged a wordless acknowledgement of the inexplicable events we had just witnessed. The exorcism marked a turning point in my life. It forced me to confront the limits of human understanding and to acknowledge that there are forces in this world that defy all attempts at explanation. I had always prided myself on being a rational psychologist, but that night, I had come face to face with the unknown, and it had left an indelible mark on my soul. My name is John, and I was once a priest. But now, I'm a self-proclaimed atheist, a man who had turned his back on the faith he once held dear. Little did I know that my past would come back to haunt me in the most terrifying way possible. It all began when I received a desperate call late one evening. The voice on the other end was frantic, choked with fear and despair. It was the voice of Mark Thompson, an old friend from seminary who had also left the clergy. "John, you have to help us," Mark pleaded. "It's Isabella. She's not herself anymore." I could hear the tremor in Mark's voice, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He explained that his daughter, Isabella, had been acting strangely for weeks. She had become withdrawn, her once bright eyes now vacant and filled with a darkness that defied explanation. She spoke in tongues that were beyond any language known to man, and her body contorted in ways that were unnatural and horrifying. Mark and his wife, Susan, were devout believers, but their faith had done little to protect their family from the malevolent force that had taken hold of Isabella. They had sought help from priests and paranormal investigators, all to no avail. It seemed that their desperation had led them to me, a former priest turned non-believer. I hesitated, torn between my skepticism and the genuine fear in Mark's voice. I had left the priesthood after witnessing too many horrors that I could not reconcile with my faith. But now, faced with the terror that had gripped my friend's family, I couldn't turn my back on them. I arrived at the Thompsons' home, a stately old mansion that had seen better days. The air inside was heavy with a sense of foreboding, and the walls seemed to whisper with ancient secrets. As I entered the living room, Isabella sat there, a frail figure in the midst of an opulent setting, her eyes locking onto mine. Mark and Susan explained that they had already attempted an exorcism, but it had only made things worse. Isabella's voice, which had previously been a cacophony of guttural sounds, shifted to a chilling, otherworldly tone as I began to speak. "John," Isabella's voice hissed, "you cannot save them. You cannot save yourself." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pushed forward, determined to reason with whatever had taken hold of Isabella. I recited logical and psychological explanations for her behavior, attempting to expose the possession as a delusion. But then, the room seemed to tremble, and Isabella's eyes filled with a malevolent fire. The entity within her spoke again, "You doubt the divine, John. You abandoned your faith, and now you will face the consequences." I could no longer deny the fact that something sinister had possessed this girl. I started the exorcism. The room had become a battleground of wills, with the malevolent entity within Isabella fighting tooth and nail against me. The objects in the room began to move as if possessed by a mind of their own. Books flew off the shelves, furniture slid across the floor, and the air grew heavy with a sense of dread. As I recited the prayers and incantations, Isabella's contorted body writhed and twisted, her eyes now a feral, unnatural shade. She lunged at me with inhuman strength, her hands clawing at my face. It took all of our combined efforts to restrain her and tie her to the bed. I pressed on, determined to banish the malevolent entity that had taken root in Isabella's soul. But with each passing moment, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary possession. The entity seemed to mock us, its laughter echoing through the room. "Your lack of faith is your weakness, John," Isabella's voice taunted. "You abandoned your calling, and now you will pay the price." I felt a deep sense of despair wash over me. I had become a non-believer, a man who had turned his back on the faith he had once held so dear. My skepticism had been my shield against the unexplained, but now it left me vulnerable in the face of the supernatural. The malevolent entity continued to resist, its power growing stronger with each passing moment. It hurled objects across the room, and the very walls seemed to close in on us. Isabella's laughter grew louder, more sinister, as if she reveled in our helplessness. It was then that I realized the only way to defeat this malevolent being was to confront my own disbelief, to find faith within myself once more. I closed my eyes, searching deep within, and began to recite the prayers not as a skeptic but as a man desperate to save a friend. As the words left my lips, a surge of energy filled the room. The malevolent entity screeched in agony, its hold on Isabella weakening. I continued to pray, pouring every ounce of faith and determination into the exorcism. Suddenly, the room fell still. The objects that had been in a frenzy of movement dropped to the floor, and Isabella's contorted body relaxed. Her eyes, once filled with darkness, were now clear and human. We had won. Isabella, exhausted and drained, looked at me with gratitude. The malevolent entity that had tormented her was gone, banished by the power of faith. As I left the Thompsons' home that day, I couldn't help but reflect on the ordeal I had just faced. I had been a non-believer, a man who had turned his back on the divine, but in that room, I had found something greater than skepticism. I had found the strength to confront the supernatural and emerge victorious. The malevolent entity had been banished, and Isabella was free from its grip. But I, the former priest turned atheist, had been forever changed. I had come face to face with the darkness that dwelled in the world, and I had discovered that sometimes, faith, even in the most unlikely of hearts, could be the greatest weapon against the unknown. I had always been a skeptic, a documentary filmmaker with a penchant for exploring the unexplained and debunking the supernatural. My career had been built on exposing the tricks and illusions behind supposedly haunted houses, psychic mediums, and UFO sightings. So, when the idea of making a film about modern-day exorcisms was proposed, I saw it as an opportunity to shed light on what I believed to be nothing more than superstition and folklore. I found Father Thomas, a Catholic priest known for his specialization in performing exorcisms, through a network of contacts. He was a reserved man, with a demeanor that exuded both authority and humility. When I explained my intention to make a documentary about his work, he hesitated but eventually agreed, believing it would help demystify a practice often misunderstood by the public. As we embarked on this project, my skepticism was at an all-time high. I had seen countless exorcism documentaries and read numerous accounts of supposed demonic possessions, all of which I had dismissed as elaborate hoaxes or cases of mental illness. Father Thomas assured me that he only took on cases that had been rigorously vetted by medical professionals and subjected to exhaustive psychological evaluations. Our first exorcism was scheduled at a small, unassuming church on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect location, I thought, for capturing the reality behind these rituals. The crew and I set up our equipment discreetly, eager to record every moment of the exorcism. The young woman, Angela, who was believed to be possessed, sat in the front pew, her face a mask of fear and suffering. Her family, desperate for answers, had turned to Father Thomas as a last resort. I watched as he began the ritual, reciting prayers in Latin and sprinkling holy water. Angela's reactions were violent and unsettling, her body contorting in unnatural ways. My camera captured every grimace, every guttural utterance, and every struggle, but I remained convinced that this was a case of psychological distress. I couldn't allow myself to believe otherwise. As the weeks passed, we followed Father Thomas to more exorcisms, each one seemingly more intense than the last. Angela's case was far from unique, we discovered. There were others like her, people who claimed to be tormented by malevolent forces beyond their control. But then, something began to change. Strange occurrences started happening around us. Equipment malfunctioned for no apparent reason, batteries drained within minutes of being fully charged, and chilling, disembodied whispers were captured on our audio recordings. At first, I brushed these incidents off as technical glitches, but they became too frequent to ignore. One night, after returning from an exorcism, I began to review the footage we had captured. As I watched Angela convulsing and writhing, a shadowy figure flickered in the background of the frame, its presence undeniable. My heart raced as I rewound the footage, hoping for a logical explanation, but there was none. I shared my findings with Father Thomas and the crew, expecting them to scoff at my suggestion of the supernatural. To my surprise, Father Thomas seemed unperturbed. "There are things in this world that defy explanation," he said cryptically. As the days turned into nights and the exorcisms continued, I began to feel a growing sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer just observers, that something had latched onto us, something malevolent and vengeful. One evening, while we were packing up our equipment after an exorcism, the church's candles flickered and died out simultaneously. In the suffocating darkness, I heard a voice, low and menacing, whisper my name. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The crew and I decided to review our footage one last time, hoping to find some rational explanation for the bizarre events that had plagued us. What we discovered was beyond anything I could have imagined. In the background of nearly every exorcism, we saw shadowy figures lurking, their presence growing more pronounced with each passing ritual. They seemed to watch us, their eyes filled with malevolence, and I couldn't deny the truth any longer. We were not alone, and our skepticism had crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. The voices in my head were relentless, an incessant whispering that gnawed at my sanity. They echoed with a malevolent intent, their words indistinct but filled with an undeniable malice. I couldn't escape them, couldn't find refuge from their torment, not even in the solitude of my own thoughts. I lay in bed that evening, bathed in the dim glow of a single bedside lamp. The events of the past weeks played over and over in my mind like a nightmarish film reel. The shadowy figures in our footage, the inexplicable malfunctions of our equipment, the chilling whispers, they all seemed to converge in a crescendo of dread. I had become a reluctant believer in the supernatural, a reality I had spent my entire career debunking. But my newfound belief was accompanied by a profound fear, a fear that I was no longer in control of my own destiny. The next day, I woke up feeling ill, my body weighed down by an oppressive fatigue. My head throbbed with a persistent ache, and a deep sense of foreboding settled over me like a shroud. The crew noticed the change in me, the pallor of my skin, and the haunted look in my eyes. I knew I couldn't continue down this path, couldn't allow whatever malevolent force that had attached itself to us to consume me completely. I called an emergency meeting with Father Thomas and the crew, my voice trembling with anxiety. "We need to end this," I pleaded, my words filled with a desperation I couldn't hide. "Whatever we've uncovered, it's too dangerous to continue." Father Thomas, once the bastion of unwavering faith and resolve, looked at me with a solemn understanding. He knew as well as I that the supernatural forces we faced were beyond our control. The crew, initially skeptical but now shaken by the mounting evidence of malevolence, agreed without hesitation. We decided to abandon the documentary, to cease all further involvement with exorcisms, and to dismantle our equipment. It was a decision that came with a heavy sense of relief, as if we were cutting ties with an insidious presence that had latched onto us. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to rebuild my life, haunted by the events I had witnessed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malicious was still after me, that the malevolent force we had encountered hadn't truly let go.